Jill Stein, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be with you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you very much for being back on. And, this is a really great time to have you back on as a guest because this past week or two you were smeared by Hillary Clinton in the media. She suggested that, she stated that you were a Russian asset.
Totally.
And, yeah, I guess she has evidence of that. I guess she can present, but...
Apparently not.
But yeah, she attacked Tulsi Gabbard, saying that Russia was grooming her to be a third-party candidate, even though Tulsi has repeatedly said, including on this show, that she's not going to run as a third-party candidate. And included you in the smear as well, saying that you were a Russian asset.
I'm not making any predictions, but I think they've got their eye on somebody who's currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians. They have a bunch of, sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far. And that's assuming Jill Stein will give it up, which she might not, because she's also a Russian asset.
How did you hear about this, and what was your initial reaction?
I think I first heard actually from the Wall Street Journal that
Really?
called me for a comment. Or maybe it was CNN. I don't recall which one was first, but they were on it immediately, and I got something in the email and then looked into it, and it was kind of jaw-dropping to be attacked with this ludicrous, unhinged conspiracy theory, and in part I wanted to laugh. It was like so ridiculous, and in part, I'm distressed. It's not great to be targeted and kind of put a big bullseye on your back for nutcakes to be reacting to,
especially by former Secretary of State, First Lady.
Yeah, she has a certain amount of credibility
Right.
in some quarters, and the way that this ramifies through much of the press now, which is just all about repeating what their usual sources have to say. It's very distressing, and it's really hard to get a word in edgewise. But I was really glad that more media than usual was kind of shocked by this. And in fact, I'd say, except for the Democratic Party operatives in the media, most media that I'm hearing, certainly respectable media, are saying, this is ridiculous, this is preposterous. Where's the evidence? You can't just slander people like that.
Right. I think that she did kind of jump the shark a little bit because, even on Meet the Press, hosted by Chuck Todd, and I think Chuck Todd has really, pushed Russiagate a lot. Even he seemed to agree that this was a conspiracy theory and didn't really understand what Hillary was doing. So I think she just went a little too far with this one.
I think so. But, in doing so, she kind of lifted the veil on the ways in which Russiagate is being used and misused and abused. There's a certain legitimacy to the investigation to look for illegal, violations of law in the course of the campaign. That was legal. But the way it's been exaggerated, the way the press has sort of failed to look critically at one revelation after the other, whether it's the Russians infiltrating our power supply,
right,
or accusations, we were constantly told that, the end is near, this is going to be the definitive expose around the Mueller investigation, and it never happened, and collusion was never found. And many of the convictions, like for Manafort, for example, were really fundamentally unrelated to the election. People who were being caught with money laundering and so on many years earlier. And all that is really terrible, and it should be prosecuted, and it should be put to an end. But that wasn't conspiracy with Russia. That wasn't collusion with Russia. So the investigation was misused, abused, exaggerated to fan the flames of the war machine and to help intensify this era of McCarthyism that we're in right now, with its warmongering, with its censorship, and above all with its political repression and its effort to smear, to target, and to silence critics, especially anti-war critics. And so it's very dangerous, and this is what you expect to see during a Cold War. We're in a new Cold War. We have 2,000 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert between us and the Russians. So, this is a really, you don't want to just be fanning the flames of war right now, especially without acknowledging how unbelievably off the charts dangerous this is, as our nuclear treaties are also unraveling around us. So, Hillary Clinton sort of lifted the veil on how extreme and crazy aspects of the smear campaign and Russiagate itself are. And, I think this is a good thing for us to step back now. In fact, The Guardian invited me to write a commentary for an op-ed, which was posted just on Thursday, I think, of last week. And it, it really raises questions that seem to be really respected out there. And we don't see any, I'm not being ridiculed for my response to this really outrageous and inflammatory and very dangerous smear campaign.
And the thing is that kind of surprised me is that you've been victim to this, since the 2016 election. I mean, Rachel Maddow has said things about you.
Have you ever noticed the other person who you recognize sitting at that table?
No, who's it?
Jill Stein.
Oh!
Jill Stein is sitting on the other side of Putin, in the foreground of that picture. Can we please see that? See the gray hair in the front there? That is Jill Stein.
Oh, shit.
Yes.
Jill Stein just took the stack of hundreds from her ear like, yo, why you snitching? I told you it was funny.
Yo, delete that Snapchat.
I know.
Oh, Rachel, what you doing?
I know, so everybody's like, wow, how come this super aggressive opposition that we saw with these third-party candidates, how come they haven't said anything since this Trump scandal is broken? I don't know, Jill! I can't pronounce it in Russian.
No!
There's been just a constant smear campaign against you, and I think it surprised me a little bit that there was a pushback this time, just because that hasn't really happened before. So were you surprised by that aspect of it?
In a way, yes. I was surprised to see the pushback, but I think the way Hillary presented this as part of this, this Russian conspiracy that included me and included Tulsi Gabbard, and in fact she's being groomed, to be a third-party candidate. And the way Hillary Clinton basically trashed all third parties as Russian assets.
Right.
Or I should say, she painted it against all third parties, but is she objecting to Gary Johnson? No. She's strictly directed this at her political competition. They are very afraid that there will be a repeat of 2016 in terms of a Dem exit, when the DNC once again engineers the anointing of a centrist candidate, whether it's Joe Biden or who it will be, I think is unclear, but there's definitely war going on still against the progressive candidates and anyone who breathes a word about the war machine and opposition to this unbelievably dangerous and crazy war in which we are embroiled abroad, that is bankrupting us at home and that contributes to basically the sellout of our democracy and certainly our foreign policy. So this is the stuff that needs to be examined. I think Hillary Clinton and the Democrats are trying to take steps right now. They're trying to make an example of me and Tulsi Gabbard in the same way they have of Susan Sarandon, that if you are a candidate who speaks out, you will be destroyed. That if you are a informed and caring voter, you too will be destroyed, you will be attacked, you will be vilified if you dare to speak out against this system which is destroying our economy, global security, and and dragging the climate absolutely over the cliff right now. So at the time that I think so many people really want to stand up and protest and vote for something else, they are really doubling down. That is, the political establishment is doubling down to prevent that from happening, particularly from progressives. And let me just mention one other thing. That is a poll done by the Wall Street Journal about a month ago, a little more than a month ago, that found 70% of Americans now are not just fed up, they are fighting angry at the political establishment that has thrown them under the bus. So there is just, we've reached the boiling point on political discontent. So the establishment is doubling down in order to eliminate the options to which people can go. There's one other thing that I think is really key to this discussion. For anyone who buys into this idea that third parties might be a Russian plot to tip the election, any such person, including Hillary Clinton, who believes, third parties are the foreign assets, or Russian assets or any other, they should be pulling out all the stops right now to pass ranked choice voting right now, as the state of Maine did. It took us 1 week to come up with almost $1 trillion to bail out Wall Street against the desires and wishes of the American public, no less. That took 1 week. Can we not fix this issue in our election system, which really stands on its own terms? You don't have to buy into the Russia hysteria to understand that if we're going to fix our democracy, if we're going to get an election result that actually reflects the vision of the American people rather than their fears, we need a voting system that lets you vote your values, that lets you guide our direction forward with your vision and your values. So if you haven't heard of ranked choice voting, it is a voting system that lets you rank your choices like you do all the time, every day. People know how to rank their choices. This is just drop dead simple. You can rank your choices knowing that if your first choice loses, your vote's automatically reassigned to your second choice. That's a simplified explanation, but that basically gets at the crux of it. So you never have to worry about having unintended consequences of your vote. By voting for the person you value most, you're not going to be helping the person you are most afraid of. That just can't happen. You can't split the vote, you can't so-called spoil the election, and you can never waste your vote. So it's a win-win all around. It's working great in the state of Maine. It brings out more voters. It creates greater diversity of choices, which is what people are begging for. They want more voices and more choices in the election. Ranked choice voting allows this to happen. So, getting back to the major point here, anybody who's afraid of third parties and who is self-censoring because of that, which is a terrible thing. If we're censoring ourselves, we can't, then people are just pointing the finger and blaming and shaming voters. We should be able to have a respectful civil debate and civil discourse. And ranked choice voting enables that to happen. You don't have to worry about people throwing the election. The election is going to be a valid representation of how you feel. And for people who want to look into this, you can go to fairvote.org, which has done a lot of work. There are many cities around the country that use it. The state of Maine has it now. In Massachusetts, we are completing a ballot drive, a referendum drive right now, getting signatures in order to put this on the ballot in 2020. But if we really stood up and declared this to be an emergency of democracy, which our elections really are, we could pass it. I mean, legislatures could pass this in the blink of an eye, and it's as simple as reprogramming how the votes are counted. Regardless of which method that uses, this can be done, and it can be done right now. There's no excuse not to.
What are the Democrats' arguments against that, against ranked choice?
They mostly just try to suppress it.
Okay, so they don't even debate it?
No, they don't. And in the state of Maine, the voters had to run 3 separate ballot drives because Democrats and Republicans in the legislature kept blocking it. So they tried to come up with constitutional arguments. In Maine, you're allowed to win with a plurality of the vote rather than a majority, whereas ranked choice voting ensures that nobody wins unless they can get a majority of the vote. So they were arguing on really kind of technical grounds that were really in the weeds. They're really clutching at straws to try to, hold their, to keep their stranglehold on political power.
Hmm. Well, just this whole thing overall, it seems so transparently self-serving to me. And specifically for looking back, I mean, you weren't just the Green Party nominee in 2016. You were the nominee in 2012, and that election cycle, Obama went after Mitt Romney for saying that Russia was our #1 geopolitical foe.
Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that al-Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back, because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. But, Governor, when it comes to our foreign policy, you seem to want to import the foreign policies of the 1980s.
Was Barack Obama a Russian asset at that time too, if he was saying those things? From our perspective, looking at this, I think we can recognize how incoherent it is, but there's so many Democrats out there who, just hearing the mainstream media, oh, our democracy was attacked, this was like Pearl Harbor, this was like 9/11, and they're just, so worked up about it, and then plus the fact that, Trump is a terrible person, and hating Trump gets tied in with this whole Russiagate thing. I don't know how we can break through that. I mean, I think one part of it was probably Robert Mueller's testimony and how terrible that went and all the, sort of embarrassing moments that happened in that. But it seemed like even that didn't really kill this whole Russiagate narrative. It seems like it's still alive and well, as we saw with what Hillary said.
It's true, but, you have to ask, for whom is it alive and well? And it seems to be really confined to the party faithful, and the super faithful. Polls show that the American people are really not buying this at all. How much are the political candidates talking about, Russian interference? Like, not at all. It's not an issue.
Amy Klobuchar was.
Well, I don't think she's flying off the charts in the polls. And their Gallup poll, I think it was Gallup, yeah, it was, not long ago, I think it was in September, actually asked voters what are the most important issues. 0.5%, not even 1%, said that Russian interference was like their critical issue. Nobody's buying this. And
but they still are pushing, and actually I just remembered I saw a Joe Biden ad recently where it's actually very sad. It's him in a very dull, monotone voice, saying that the country's under attack and Putin doesn't want him to be president.
Folks, you hear the news. Once again, Putin and the Russians are trying to engage in our elections and decide who the president's going to be. And this time I'm the object of their attention. Because Putin knows if I am president of the United States, his days of tyranny and trying to intimidate the United States and those in Eastern Europe are over. I'm going to stand up to him. He's a bully, just like the president. And I know he doesn't want me to be president, but to tell you what, when I'm president, things are going to change. Mr. Putin, the American people decide their elections, not you. Chip in $1, $5, $10.
When do you think this will end? How long do you think it will go on for? Through the Trump years, or is this going to be just an extended Cold War for decades again?
Well, there's no doubt, that we have been beating the drums of the Cold War really for quite some time. And, it began actually with Clinton. If you look at, Clinton's encroachment into Eastern Europe, and prior to Clinton, there had been an agreement that NATO was not going to be moving to Russia's borders. And, Russia's been invaded 2 or 3 times in the course of history, and has been devastated. And in the Second World War, lost something like 27 million people. I mean, Russia is understandably concerned about its borders in the same way that we are. I mean, what did we do when there were Russian missiles coming into Cuba?
Right.
We threatened nuclear war, and we were on the brink there for a while. Fortunately, we had leaders that were on both sides that were capable of talking to each other. And that gets to be very confusing right now. But suffice it to say, NATO and the U.S. armed forces and allies have been surrounding Russia for a while. And, George Bush first withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which began to unravel the nuclear arms agreements. So things have been ramping up for quite a while.
And I honestly, I have a hard time even trying to figure out where exactly went wrong. Like, it seems like maybe Libya, maybe Ukraine, but something really, again, going from Barack Obama in 2012 talking about how Russia was not our number one geopolitical foe to now saying, you know, that they're the red menace again. they're the evil empire. So it's
hard
odd
to know, you know, how much was world events and how much was just the growth of the military industry here and its ability to influence foreign policy, you know. And as money and power become more concentrated, we become more of an empire, and an empire needs to feed the beast. And you know, so the empire, you know, needs an enemy, and Russia is a convenient enemy. You know, they also have a tiny military budget. Their entire budget is the size of the increase in our military budget from one year to the next. You know, so it's kind of, what Russia does have is nuclear weapons. You know, that's very dangerous. Not only dangerous, but it's also bankrupting both of our countries. We're in a new nuclear weapons arms race right now, and all our old defenses are you know, at risk of becoming obsolete, and then we need a whole new generation, not only of nuclear weapons, but also of the missile defense against them. So, you know, this is a devastating problem for us, aside from the security concerns financially. It's outrageous. It's over 60% of our discretionary budget in Congress right now. So this is why we don't have the money for our schools and, you know, for healthcare and everything else. I mean, 60% is most of the budget, and you know, we all pay the price for that, and it's not making us more secure, you know. And as this industry becomes more and more powerful, it has greater and greater control over our foreign policy. You know, if you look at the way, for example, the F-35, this is sort of a classic example, it will cost us something like $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion by the time it's fully produced, maintained, and, you know, over its lifespan. It's a huge amount of money, and that money gets spent in its production in just about every state has its piece of this pie. So it's very hard to then get a handle on this boondoggle of a weapons system, which is hugely expensive. Or you can look at the recent study of the unaccounted for money in the Pentagon budget. It was something like 20 or 21 trillion dollars over approximately the last 20 years in Pentagon transactions that can't be accounted for. If that's not a red flag for, you know, waste, fraud, and abuse, what is? So we've got this very powerful monster now. And then you have these military analysts and propagandists who've now been incorporated into U.S. media and into our so-called security think tanks. So, you know, we previously were protected against propaganda by our own government. And I think that started like way back in the church hearings, like back in, what was it, the 60s or the early 70s. We were protected against propaganda. There were some exposés about the CIA colluding with media.
Right, Project Mockingbird.
That's right.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI.
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Yeah, and when that got exposed, we got protected against propaganda, which allowed the press to actually do some real investigative reporting. And as of 2013, I believe it was, those protections were repealed, and it thereby became legal and legitimate to start, concocting media campaigns that included our security agencies and the military working with media. And we don't know exactly where this is operating, but it's clear it's going on. And that too is certainly biasing our foreign policy because it gives them a completely free hand to concoct stories, to really beat the war drums and to goad people into this fearful mindset that underscores the Cold War.
And I mean, it seems like, just realistically, there's not really any sort of motivation for the corporate media not to repeat this, because you want to have access to politicians who are pushing it. It's good ratings for them because it's like a spy novel. They also have advertisers like Raytheon and Boeing and all these military industrial complex companies. So it just seems like they want to push it in their own interests. And also, I think that there is a big pushback on dissent. I even see that as a content creator, just how things get demonetized and how people have been deplatformed, like the Free Thought Project and the anti-media, they have their Facebook pages taken down. And you see this with other examples too. And most prominently with Julian Assange and how he was arrested, after all of the fury about 2016, everything happened there with him exposing the DNC corruption. Then he becomes this Russian asset also, and he gets dragged out of the embassy there, which I think is a violation of international law also.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think Assange is kind of the, he's sort of like the ultimate example of what happens when the suppression of dissent is allowed to take place without, with impunity, and the way that Assange has basically been put through a series of show trials. And this is according to the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer. Are you familiar with his? Worth looking at, because those of us who've tried to take an objective look at the war on Julian Assange, there's an effort to marginalize us and silence us.
Definitely.
And so Niels Melzer had the case brought to his attention as the UN Rapporteur on Torture, and he had no sympathy for Julian Assange because he too has seen mostly the smear campaigns, and he said that he went into this not completely without a favorable viewpoint, and then studied what had actually happened to him. And he came out of his study saying he has never seen a single individual so persecuted by several democracies who have essentially violated Assange's human rights. The legal system has really been perverted, and Meltzer calls it irregularities have occurred in the law system. To my mind, it's a complete mockery of justice what's going on. If people read about his hearings that have just basically indefinitely confined him without charges against him in order to keep him from to prevent him from fleeing, but they're also preventing him from preparing for his trial, for his extradition trial. So, the way he has been railroaded for 7 years, really, into, a firing squad is just terrifying. And it's as if we are watching, the worst of old Soviet Russia show trial and an example, or in North Korea, it's like the worst things out there are going on right now under our noses, and it's involved not only the US and the UK, but also Sweden, which was complicit in concocting rape charges against him. And there's a whole backstory to that. But in Sweden, basically, the charge of rape includes that your condom burst. And, so it's really on that basis that those charges were filed and initially against him in Sweden. And this whole story has been concocted. He was essentially told he could leave Sweden by the prosecutor in Sweden. He was waiting to, to have his day in court around that. Charges were on again, off again, depending on which prosecutor got involved too. It's a very weird story, but he was waiting in order to be a part of the process and to clear his name. He was told by the prosecutor he could leave, and the moment he left, they sounded an emergency terrorism red alert on the pretext that he had fled his hearing and his proceedings. So at any rate, Meltzer, the UN rapporteur, makes all this clear about how Assange has really been railroaded into a firing squad,
including with the Ecuadorian government too, right? Wasn't there some kind of IMF deal or something that happened right before?
That's right. Yes.
The British police went into the embassy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it looks like the Ecuador was bought off, and and Assange was spied upon, as well as his attorneys, and
that was insane too. That story that broke about how they had installed cameras and they had I guess there was a baby that was brought to see him, and they took the baby's diaper to see if there was DNA that matched to Assange. It just was insane.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. And what's really horrifying in my view is that while his attorneys have brought all these things to court, they're just dismissed. And John Pilger, who's one of the journalists, the European journalists, UK or Australian, I forget where he's from, but across the pond somewhere, a very highly regarded journalist who's another truth teller, he makes the point that the magistrates who've been hearing Assange's cases have had huge conflicts of interest in that they are married to, I think both of them were partners with people who are sort of part of the political elite, which is, has been criticized by Assange. So they have, and the whole military, empire that Assange is trying to hold accountable. So they have very personal stakes in this, and it's really outrageous that they have not recused themselves and that they've been allowed to really conduct kangaroo courts. So this is really terrible, and I really encourage people to go to, to the Assange websites or to Meltzer's website, the UN rapporteur, and and make your voice heard. We can't allow this to happen.
It's great too that there are people speaking up. I mean, Roger Waters from Pink Floyd, he's been really vocal about this, and there's been demonstrations. So it is great. If Assange is extradited to the U.S., do you think that he'll also face a kangaroo court here?
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, it's known that his case is going to be heard, I think, the same place where Chelsea Manning's case is heard. Some court, I think in Virginia, that is known to they just lock them up and throw away the key in these kinds of whistleblower security cases. And Chelsea Manning is certainly another one who's been just horrifically treated, is really, kind of doing double jeopardy right now, in prison again, basically being held in solitary confinement. I think she's also being charged $1,000 a day. I mean, this absolutely punitive punishment that she's enduring for refusing to cooperate with the grand jury that's trying to railroad Julian Assange, into espionage convictions.
Yeah, it is really sad. I mean, it seems like all Julian Assange is trying to do is, be a legitimate journalist, be a legitimate voice for truth, and he has just been endlessly persecuted for that crime. It's really just a tragedy of our era.
And it's shocking what he has exposed too, that he and all the media that's, the corporate media that's failing to come to his attention has really benefited from the material that Assange put out, really exposing lies, war crimes, just incredible transgressions on the part of power, and how whistleblowers are supposed to be a part of the system. That's a part of how we hold power accountable.
Well, yeah, look at how they're glamorizing this Ukraine gate whistleblowers, There's such double think on that because they're glorifying them, but, not Assange, not Chelsea Manning, not Edward Snowden, not, all of these other folks, Bill Binney. There's so many, and,
John Kiriakou as well. Yes, I mean, these people who've been heroic in standing up against, Edward Snowden, of course, people who have stood up to defend our basic fundamental liberties are now paying the ultimate price. And that includes Chelsea Manning, too. It's just... it is not a good sign. And, to my mind, these crises are kind of converging. We have a real crisis of democracy. We have a crisis of our civil liberties. We have a crisis of our climate. We have a crisis of concentrated power and economic wealth and inequality and racial injustice. And it's not just hitting in the U.S., it's hitting all over the world. And what are we seeing? We are seeing people out in the streets like really never before. What was it yesterday? Over 1 million people out in the streets in Chile. What are they protesting in Chile? The same neoliberal system that's basically been inflicted here and around the world. They were protesting, I think, a rate hike in their public transit system. But it's the straw that broke the camel's back.
Right.
The economic injustice that we are fighting here in this country, where 3 billionaires have the wealth of half of the American population. This is just staggering. It's inconceivable. And it's not getting better. It's only getting worse. Even under a Democratic White House with 2 Democratic houses of Congress, it continued to get worse. When they had the chance, who did they bail out? Not the homeowners, but the crooks on Wall Street who crashed the economy. Our political and economic system is very sick, and it has been for many decades and under both parties. So people are rising up, and this is inevitable. It is unstoppable. The question is, how quickly will the change happen? Change is coming, and it's really incumbent on all of us to stand up on our deeply held human values to ensure that change goes in the right direction. At times of awful instability like this, you don't want things flipping, to demagogues like Trump again, and we sort of saw that happen again in Brazil, in India, in the Philippines, in Europe, in Hungary. We're seeing demagogues and dictators grabbing power. At times of great insecurity, people are really vulnerable to demagogues that provide a certain kind of comfort and an outlet for anger. But we've seen where that goes. Now it's really interesting that we're seeing a people's movement rising up again that is absolutely unstoppable. And who are they rising up against? They are rising up against this empire and against dictatorship and against this neoliberal agenda of privatization and austerity and inequality and deregulation and militarization. People are standing up against that, and this is very exciting. And bringing that home, to the U.S., we have 2 political parties, big parties, which are the parties of war and Wall Street, and they're both incredibly compromised. Principled people have been fighting within the Democratic Party for a long time to take it back from the forces of oligarchy and militarism. But they're not succeeding. They are failing. It's only getting worse. 100 million people now are refusing to vote for either of the corporate political parties. That's as opposed to 62 million who voted for Trump and 63 million who voted for Clinton. We got 100 million who are disproportionately black, brown, millennial, and poor, so they are inherently, favorable to a progressive agenda, which we know prevails in poll after poll, whether you're talking about healthcare as a human right under Medicare for all, or a Green New Deal with the right to a job, and and an emergency plan to fix the climate crisis, which can be done if we actually move on it now, whether it's free college public higher education, abolishing student debt, that's what people support, that's what people want, and I should add to that a respectful pathway to citizenship, particularly for the people who are fleeing the consequences of our foreign policy. So, Americans mostly have hearts. We are not brain dead and we are not heart dead. We have been struggling to find a political vehicle to hold power accountable and to move into a future consistent with our values. And the two political parties have definitively failed. There is no sign that the Democrats, and certainly not the Republicans, are seeing the light, that they are coming back from the dark side. To the contrary, the dark side is more in control than ever. If you look at the campaign contributions, the DNC is fighting against Medicare for all. They ridicule the Green New Deal. They don't support a student bailout or free college. They're looking to elect a Joe Biden, and another Hillary Clinton, and maybe, who knows, Hillary is said maybe to have been testing the waters by jumping into the media like that for a possible run. So, my point is that sometimes they get bad before they get better, and maybe we are at that pinnacle right now, and I really encourage people to become part of real resistance, to really look at political transformation, and stop beating a dead horse inside the Democratic Party. It's not going to happen, and really get behind ranked choice voting and push for it to happen in your state right now, so that we can actually go into the next election, like the state of Maine, and be able to vote for what it is we need.
So I did want to bring it back to the Hillary Clinton thing, because I did have a question about that, because she said you are a Russian asset, pretty clearly. You've also had these smears against you from various public figures in the corporate media and politicians. Have you ever considered any kind of legal action or lawsuit against any of these people? Mm-hmm. Are you going to be pursuing?
We'll see.
Yeah.
I'm sort of exploring whether that's possible or not. Because it's not a small thing, It's
Sure.
not a small thing to have to turn your life around to fight these smears.
Right.
But to my mind, it's not just the smears we're fighting. We're really fighting a democracy that's been hijacked. And it's very important to break that stranglehold right now. So, to my mind, it's a battle worth fighting, and I'm fighting for much more than myself. But if I had my druthers, there are other ways I would rather be fighting that battle. So we'll see.
Okay.
You brought to mind, about sort of where this smear began, and I think Hillary took the smear off the charts, she made this like the headline. But where it began actually was sort of like analogous to Tulsi. It started for Tulsi right after she declared.
Yep. It was actually hours before she officially declared. NBC put out the New Knowledge report that had the information from New Knowledge, which was a company that was exposed for creating fictitious fake Russian bots in the Alabama Senate race. They had advised on this NBC report that Russia was going to be propping up her campaign, and this came out, I believe it was 6 hours before her event where she kicked off her presidential run.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm not aware of exactly the timing, but I know that they, that they happened at about the same time. And we'll come back to New Knowledge because it's worth underscoring a couple things about that.
Definitely.
But for me, it started right after I got the nomination, right after I got the Green Party nomination. Suddenly they were circulating photos and videos out of context that suggested that, they used to suggest that I was a Putin supporter, which was absolutely false. But that began right at that time, and then it accelerated. And I had been to Moscow for a media conference that included the likes of the BBC and the Canadian Broadcasting System and China TV and the largest network in India. This was a major opportunity to speak to press from all over the world. And I was there to promote my agenda of a peace offensive in the Middle East, telling Russia they should stop bombing Syria, which they had just begun. I was, in no uncertain terms, critical of Russia's foreign policy at that point. I was promoting a nuclear weapons ban and a global Green New Deal. So
you had announced all this publicly too, saying that this is why I'm going here, right?
Yes, and my remarks were on the web. I think they still are. A video of my speech at this conference. I had announced that I had this dinner afterwards and that Putin was briefly at the table. I mean, all of this was absolutely public. I had announced also that I was raising money in order to do it, because part of the smear was that my trip had been paid for and that I was in this kind of quid pro quo deal with Putin, that I was getting financial support from Putin in order to, spoil the election. And, so there was this outrageous smear that was completely false and included false information, as well as omitting all the proper context. There's a gazillion photos of Hillary whispering into the ear of Putin and vice versa at the time that Bill Clinton was paid $500,000 for a single speech to a church, a bank, for a single speech to a bank involved in the Uranium One deal that allowed a Russian-owned company to purchase 20% of U.S. uranium supply, a decision over which Hillary Clinton had substantial control. So there's shady stuff there that merits an investigation. My interaction with Putin involved sitting at a table briefly while he was there before he gave a speech in Russian, at which there were no translators.
And again, you didn't actually know that he was going to sit with you, right?
I had been told.
Okay.
And I thought, oh, great, maybe I can speak to him directly about my concerns. But it was clear he was not there to speak to anybody. He was not at the table. He marched in with a group of people that I thought were all his bodyguards. This was like just before his speech. He sat down at the table. No one was introduced. The guy on my left was, I thought, one of his bodyguards. It turned out it was like his chief of staff or something like that. But no one was introduced. English speakers spoke to each other. The one person near me who spoke English was a German diplomat. And I spoke to him most of the evening. He was really the only person I talked to at that table. Gorbachev was there, a few tables away. Jesse Ventura was there, the former candidate from the Justice Party.
Rocky
Anderson was there. Any number of political and academic people involved in the peace community were there. It was a very interesting meeting and set of discussions. And so, there was a video where I discussed that in Red Square. I gave a speech thanking my supporters for having funded the trip and explaining how really interesting it was to be meeting with people from from all over the U.S. and all over the world. Ray McGovern was there, the former CIA agent, now peace advocate and security analyst. So it was a really exciting discussion. And I really wanted them to know that I, as a candidate, that the American people have more choices than just the two war parties that the media covers. So it was a great opportunity for dialogue. And that was what the first video that circulated was my thanking my supporters and reporting kind of what an exciting dialogue was going on and the strength of the peace and human rights community that was there. That was taken by a Democratic Party operative who who basically used it to say that I was praising Putin's human rights.
How?
There was nothing of the kind in that video, but you know how this stuff gets used. People don't look at the contents of the video,
Sure.
they just look at the title that goes with it. So that's how it began. Then it was the photograph that was snapped when Putin was sitting at the table, and that was used, Michael Flynn was there. At the time, he wasn't part of Trump's campaign, but he had been known as he opposed the war in Iraq, I believe, or he opposed the war on terror, I think, was his claim to fame as the head of the military military intelligence. I think he was briefly head of military intelligence, and Obama had let him go after some weeks or months. He wasn't there very long, but he had a reputation. That's, I wasn't aware of who he was at the time. He was just a guy that had some military title, and I thought that was interesting. So when he came over to introduce himself at the table, I gave him my elevator speech about why I was there to support a peace offensive in the Middle East. And it was clear we had absolutely nothing to say to each other, and that's where the conversation ended. So he was at the table, but that photo captured him,
Right.
as well as Putin, and then the other people who were Putin's staff that all got labeled in the photo. But you didn't know that sitting there, and it was made to look like there was something nefarious and dangerous going on that I was a part of, and that's when this smear turned from Putin supporter to colluding with Russia. And that then spilled over into an investigation by the Senate Intelligence Committee, which investigated me and the recount for being part of this collusion with Russia.
How would the recount be collusion with Russia? Doesn't make any sense.
Well, what makes sense is that the recount is the opposite
Yeah,
of collusion
exactly.
with anybody. And somehow these members of the Senate Intelligence Committee thought that the recount was a tool used by Russia to instill doubts about the election, as if daylight
It's insane.
created, daylight is the solution. Transparency is the solution to public doubt.
Right.
The way to inspire confidence
But that's
is
all.
by looking.
That's all they've done is question the integrity of the election by saying that Russia interfered in the election. They've been saying that for the last 3 years.
Yes, exactly. Which is why they should pass ranked choice voting right now. I think they did right by prioritizing paper ballots and good, rigorous audits. And that was the agenda of our recount. And that's why we are still fighting lawsuits. We're involved in an active one in Wisconsin and one that may become reactivated in Pennsylvania right now. But this has been, to push paper ballots and to be able to inspect the software for any kind of tampering. Election software has not been inspected. So when they say, there's no evidence of tampering, it's because there is no evidence, period. It hasn't been inspected after the fact. So we've been continuing.
Well, it's like
this
the
lawsuit to do that.
DNC server, that the FBI never saw. They just
right.
got a redacted report from CrowdStrike.
Yes, and speaking of which, why wasn't Julian Assange allowed to testify for the Mueller hearings? Let's hear it from the guy himself. Let's hear it from the horse's mouth. Where did that, where did that information come from? And did the Russians provide it? They don't want him to testify. By all appearances, it looks like they're just trying to, shut him up permanently.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think you wanted to mention something about new knowledge also.
So you mentioned how new knowledge was used to smear Tulsi.
Right.
But the reality was new knowledge had already been exposed for, as you mentioned, creating fake Russian bots, creating a fake Russian bot.
To make it look as though Russia was interfering in the Alabama Senate race when they weren't.
Which gets down to the point, these are election meddlers. They create false flag Russian interference campaigns, but they do that in order to meddle in our elections.
Right.
And they were meddling on behalf of the Democratic candidate who didn't know about it himself, but there were Democratic Party operatives who were funding this and who were behind it. So this is outrageous that a so-called professional cybersecurity agency that is essentially a double agent. You know, they're acting like a double agent. They're pretending to be Russians in order to serve, in this case, a Democratic Party. You know, so they were actually stripped of their Facebook privileges. Well, at least one of their executives is barred from using Facebook because he's a crook, and they perpetrate fraud. So this is who our intelligence community is relying on, and the press is relying on. They are being advised by the perpetrators of electoral fraud.
Right.
These are crooks. They should be formally investigated and and duly punished.
Well, it's like Brennan getting the job at NBC when he was involved with the Russia investigation to begin with. So it's just, it seems like there's not much accountability, at least. I did want to go back to Tulsi Gabbard, because what was interesting about this from my perspective was that when you were on my show last time, you had mentioned that Tulsi Gabbard should run with the Democratic Party. With the Green Party, excuse me. And your argument was that it would help build the Green Party, and that she may not win. But you mentioned, you can't. Your words were, you can't have a revolution and a counter-revolutionary party, which seemed like a good argument. So I asked Tulsi Gabbard about that last time she was on the show, and she said that third parties are not viable, and that the only way that you can get change is within the two main parties.
I'm very concerned with building a real system of integrity that's not going to get wiped out in this election, that's not going to get wiped out by a party that opposes it, which was my summary of what I thought about Sanders' campaign, which is that you can't have a revolution in a counter-revolutionary party. It's just not going to happen. We really have to build, a political structure for transformation. And I think she should become a Green, and I think that would be really magical, and that would really be powerful and would make change in a way that can't be beaten back. She might not win the election, but that way, we would build a really firm base for building forward.
I also had Jill Stein on the show, and some Green Party candidates that are running in the 2020 election, and she and someone else had mentioned that they might like you to run with the Green Party. Is that something that you would ever consider, or are you dead set on supporting the Democratic nominee, whoever that might be?
Yeah, I'm not going to run as a third-party candidate or as an independent. The reality is that our country has a two-party system right now, and frankly, it's not viable to think that a third-party candidate in this day and age will be able to be successful in that election. My energy is, I've always been a Democrat, and my energy is focused on being the Democratic nominee, being in that position where I can be the president and leading our party towards bringing about the kinds of reforms that it needs, rooting out the corruption within our own party, and making it so that the Democratic Party truly represents the interests of the people and our planet.
Do you still think that she should reconsider and run with the Green Party? Do you think that would play into Hillary Clinton's accusations here? And just any other thoughts that you have on Tulsi?
So, in my view, that thinking that you can only change the system by being inside of a corrupt system, that leads to exactly what's happening. Tulsi will be sabotaged. She will continue to be sabotaged. I don't think it's the Democratic Party is likely to change their ways. They've been doing this since the Second World War, when they shut the microphone off at the Democratic Convention, where Henry Wallace, a very principled Democratic socialist, you could say, was about to be nominated for vice president under FDR. In FDR's clearly last term, where the vice president would basically become president during the term. And so the Democratic Party has been doing this for a long time, and they keep holding up progressive champions, Kucinich, Jesse Jackson, Barack Obama supposedly, and we see how progressive he was, and the way that Sanders was sabotaged. So the Democrats haven't shown an inkling of a tendency to move in the right direction here. So in my view, change is not coming through the Democratic Party, and we don't have many more election cycles to fiddle around with this. The ship is going down rather fast. We have seen dramatic change come with independent third parties, whether they come to power or not. That's where change happens. I mean, even for the trickle of media coverage we got in the last cycle, what happened? We injected the Green New Deal, a bailout for student debt, free public higher education, Medicare for All, which had actually been launched by Ralph Nader as a Green in the 2000 campaign. So, we're sort of, we are creating enormous change by being an unapologetic, people-powered political party. Occasionally, at times of great crisis, third parties become major parties, and that happened with the Republican Party, which arose during abolition, and the Republicans were the advocates, the political advocates for abolition. And that's when they won, so and became a major party. So these changes do happen, and I think it's a struggle. But if you look at the numbers, 70% are screaming for, they've had it. They've had it with the political establishment, both parties. And, 100 million people, the largest voting bloc, is choosing not to vote for either of them. So the makings of a political revolution are here, but the stranglehold on the Democratic Party is as strong as ever. And, you have to kind of know that. You have to see that in your bones, and you have to see the strength of the political rebellion that's going on in order to break free from the Democratic Party. I think ranked choice voting really enables people to freely make their choices. So that's why I'm kind of focusing my efforts on promoting ranked choice voting and helping those movements build in various states. And I'm also involved, I should say, in a ranked choice voting Senate race for the U.S. Senate in Maine, where we have a wonderful Green candidate named Lisa Savage, who would be great actually for you to talk with, because it is a poster child of real political dialogue and civil discourse that's happening in the state of Maine right now, because nobody's finger pointing that you're going to spoil the election. No, you're going to spoil the election. So we have a real anti-war, pro-people candidate for single payer and for student bailout, and who's able to take the stands that even the progressive Democrats aren't really taking. She can take those stands, especially on the war. She can really stand up and tell it like it is. So it's very exciting to see this dialogue rolling forward, and in a place where she really has a fighting chance. That website, for people who want to check that out, is lisaformaine.org. That's Lisa, F-O-R, Maine.org. And I think this race can really be a flagship nationally, a flagship race for people to discover, people across the country to discover what it's like when the issues really get debated, and to discover that, you could have a voting system too that lets you actually liberate the power of your values and your vision.
What was interesting about the Hillary Clinton thing also is that you can tell Hillary doesn't really pay attention, because you have said repeatedly that you're not going to run for the nomination this year, and she had said that you were holding on and not going to give it up, or made that insinuation too. And Tulsi Gabbard has repeatedly said she's not going to run a third party, but that didn't stop her from making that accusation. So it all kind of was out of left field. I just want to double check, are you still not running for the Green Party nomination this year?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And so I did want to talk about the Green Party nomination. So there are several candidates running. One of them is Howie Hawkins. He appears to be the front runner. I had him on my show back in, it was actually just a few weeks before he officially announced. It was back in May. So he had said a couple of interesting things in that interview that I want to go over. One of them was about your trip to Russia. He said that he actually was on an advisory committee to you and he had advised you not to go. I just would be interested overall, what are your thoughts on the way that Jill Stein has been treated by the corporate media following the 2016 election?
Well, I was part of an advisory group to Jill, and I advised her not to go to that RT thing.
Why?
And in fact, well, I thought it was a setup. RT is, Russian propaganda. There's a lot of good programming on it, and they don't really interfere with that. Chris Hedges, Larry King, I don't know if Larry's still on there, Tom Hartman. But there's also, when the news comes from central headquarters, they get all kinds of crazy conspiracy people on there. Old LaRouche people, the Lyndon LaRouche, right. Conspiracy people and others. So I didn't trust them. And actually another person said, they could take a picture that would just overshadow everything you say.
And he had also mentioned that somebody actually specifically said that they might snap a photo that would undermine what you were saying. Did that actually happen?
Did Howie make those points? Is that
Yes.
what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall. I know our advisory group had debated this, and we were aware that there were potential, that it could be used manipulatively against us. But, we felt like, and I have to say, this was the predominant feeling of the group, that we can't shy away from this because it's controversial. We really need to push a peace agenda, and that we would likely be targeted because of that in one way or another. If this wasn't going to be easy to hold power accountable, but that's what we're supposed to do.
Howie had also said that same year you received an invitation from Assad to visit Syria.
Her meeting with Assad, I wouldn't have done that. In fact, that was another offer that Jill got, and she didn't do it.
Really?
On our advice, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
When did she get that invitation?
2015. And, to go with a delegation under control of the Assad regime is, that is for their purposes. You're not going to, particularly in the middle of a civil war, you're not going to be able to find out what's really going on or interview the other side.
Right. So that happened also?
That's correct, yes.
And why did you not go?
I have to say it didn't become a real possibility among our team. It was not of great interest, and that may be because I am far more informed about issues with Russia, and with Syria, there are so many complexities and intricacies to it. I did not want to wade into it without having a really good sense of what was going on there, and it remains a very complicated morass. So it wasn't something I wanted to take on as my issue.
Even now, you still see it kind of dividing people. One interesting thing that came up when I was talking to Noam Chomsky was that he actually supports U.S. troops in Syria to protect the Kurds, which was very odd to me. And I know it's been a contentious issue. I think, Howie has also talked about Syria, and there's been debate, and it just runs across the left of whether the U.S. should be there or how to deal with the issue, if we should be, I know Howie's against NATO, so I know that NATO is also, effectively helping Turkey carry out their attacks against the Kurds. So maybe by, not supporting NATO, we could mitigate that also. But I know it's a very complicated issue.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, we've been very involved in disseminating weapons of all sorts to people on all sides, and have been, as Tulsi herself mentioned in the last debate, that we have essentially armed Al-Qaeda affiliates, that our position in Syria has entailed support, that is the official U.S. position, has entailed support for so-called moderate terrorists. And, there's just awful stuff going on all sides, and we've also been involved in arming all sides. And this is, this was part of my message in going to this conference in Moscow, was that we needed a weapons embargo to the Middle East, that we're basically pouring gasoline on fires that we have created, and that we need to transition on an emergency basis to 100% clean renewable energy. And then you know what? The explosion goes out of the Middle East because we're not all fighting over the oil anymore. And, I think that's really critical. I think it's really critical that we have sort of big picture dialogue here. In Syria, bring all parties to the table, but more broadly in the Middle East, and then more broadly the US, Russia, China, others. We all need, we're all in deep trouble. We're all paying a horrible price right now for the climate crisis, which impacts us, in different ways, but we're all very much in the target here, including Russia, which has major grain shortages and fires in Siberia and, problems with drought and so on, as well as the pollution. And China, certainly the pollution is famous. And the U.S. has not played, shall we say, a positive role, even under the Obama administration, and going much further back. We have generally, behind the scenes, if not overtly, we have been fighting global climate agreements and spying on other, members of the climate summits in order to try to undermine progressive positions. So we've not been acting with a lot of integrity here. And to my mind, in order to solve the small problems, we've also got to take a good hard look at the big problems and, begin to develop, confidence building measures and start collaborating on small projects. And let me just point to Korea, because what the people of South Korea are doing in order to promote peace, a peace treaty, the cessation of hostilities, calling off their armies and their war games and so on. The people of South Korea, I find, have been so inspiring in their ability to take the big picture here and then start, take steps back about how to get to that, that ultimate goal. So they're looking at, confidence building measures on, establishing railroads and then common economic projects together. So, they're taking a very thoughtful, measured approach to laying the groundwork for long-term peace and demilitarization. In their case, reunification, but, more globally, we need to demilitarize because we've got to be putting that money right now into a global Green New Deal. And for us to benefit from decarbonization, Russia's got to decarbonize too, and they are nowhere, close to beginning to think about that. Their economy is incredibly oil dependent. So, it's going to take a lot of work to do that, but I don't think we are incapable of that, and as John Kennedy said, if I can recall the quote, something to the effect that, we must deal with our adversaries as well as those we agree with. We've got to be able to sit down and talk with everyone. And, we need to do that now more than ever. Our survival is very much dependent on each other. So I think it's really important not to be fanning the flames of the Cold War right now and to be avoiding really inflammatory rhetoric. We can protect our elections, without having to demonize Russia. I think Russia is certainly probing for vulnerabilities, as we are doing, as all countries who are capable of this are doing. But the reality of Russia's interference has just been ridiculously blown out of proportion. And, thanks to the likes of the New Knowledge firm, which is, trying to cash in on their whipping up security or, fears they're doing very dishonest work here, and that's happening on a much broader scale. So we can avoid the inflammatory rhetoric and find a human way forward to sit down and let's start talking, because we're all in the same boat right now, and that little boat is going down.
So also during my interview with Howie, we did talk about Russiagate, and he did say that the media was kind of running away with it, but he also said that he thought that Trump did collude with Russia, and that it was very clear from the Mueller investigation that there was collusion.
So the media is, they're following this Russiagate thing, which I think is serious. I think Trump ought to be impeached. I think it's obvious he saw collusion. He did collude, him and his son and his son-in-law, and it's all over that first volume of the Mueller report. It's all over there. I mean, when people say, "Oh, it showed no collusion," no, it didn't. It says, Mueller says right away, "I didn't talk about collusion. I talked about narrow legal definition of conspiracy. Plus, I can't indict a president according to this OLC letter in the Justice Department." He just laid out the evidence for prosecutors, which has to be Congress. And so I think that's all serious. But, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, from their different points of view, they're totally obsessed with that. And that's all about getting eyes on their screen to sell their advertising.
Do you think that WikiLeaks was involved in this Russian plot?
I don't know if they were working for Russia. Assange was working for himself. And I have to tell you, him giving the advice to Donald Jr. that you should protest the election if you lose. I mean, he's dealing with the son of a Klansman becoming president, an out-and-out racist who is encouraging, the right wing that's armed to come out and cause mayhem. I mean, those politics are really bad. So, if he ends up going to trial, we may find out more. I don't think he should on this 2010 charge. That's a whistleblower thing. He was a publisher, and he should be defended. But his politics in 2010, trying to give advice to Donald Jr. for the campaign, working with Trump, that's bad. I don't support that at all. So that'd be my criticism of Julian Assange. Now, how much he speaks for the whole WikiLeaks organization? Probably does, because one of his defenses was that was on WikiLeaks, not him personally, but pretty much everybody understands it was him. And whether that was with the Russians, that I think is not documented. There's circumstantial evidence. Like, well, where are the WikiLeaks about, Putin? That's the Panama Papers. A lot of stuff came out about Putin and his wealth there. So that remains to be seen if he was working with the Russians or just biased with them. We'll see. I'm not sure. But he should not be prosecuted for publishing the leaks from Bradley Manning, or what's he call himself? Chelsea.
And this kind of surprised me just because, seeing what happened to you and what happened to the Green Party and this new McCarthyism that seems very apparent, especially among progressives, it seemed as though Howie had a very different take on that, and he had more of a mainstream sort of approach that there definitely was collusion and that this was a provable fact. I don't know if you saw that interview, if you had any thoughts on just if the Green Party should be nominating somebody who is essentially adopting the Russiagate narrative.
So I've talked to Howie about this at great length, and actually I owe him a briefing paper because, and I just, it makes me very sad that people in the Green Party who should know better are vulnerable to this kind of, warmongering and propaganda. And, it takes, I think it takes some degree of information and, skepticism to be able to reject this stuff. it should not be taken at face value. You know, when James Clapper says to Congress, you know, that no, we are not and never have been, you know, surveilling the American public, you know, or when all of the security agencies are raving about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, you know, how many times do you have to go through this? Or the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, you know, that initiated the war in Vietnam. How many of these things do you have to go through before you start not taking statements of our security agencies at face value? They may be right, but they may be wrong, and you really need to look at corroborating evidence. And unfortunately, there's been such a media, you know, just orgy around Mueller, around Russiagate, around all the hysteria that gets way blown out of proportion, and then they never publish the retractions when the stories turn out to be fake.
Right.
You know, to my mind, it's very sad when people who should know better are falling for this stuff.
So what did Howie say about it when you talked to him?
He pulled back a bit, quite a bit, and said that, you know, he really looked forward to that discussion. You know, I had to dig deep, you know, because I was being accused.
Yeah, well, you're the victim of it.
Well, and let me say, I knew right away that the Steele report was a bunch of crap because it had lies about me. It said that my trip to Russia was paid for by Russia, and that was part of how they co-opted me. That's part of how they engaged me. And the Steele report said that Russia's strategy was to engage people like me from third parties, and that it had been successful in doing things like sponsoring my trip to Russia. You know, so I knew that it was full of BS. So if it was lying about me, what else was it lying about? You know, so I was not inclined whatsoever to take it at face value, or the intelligence agency's report, you know. And it really distressed me that people who know me and who were informed about our campaign could see that and then not just, you know, presume that this fear campaign is BS. So this is, you know, I think enough people have talked to Howie that he's starting to see this differently. And he seems to feel that, well, he's just being skeptical about authoritarians. Well, that's true. You should be skeptical about authoritarians, but that includes, you know, the authoritarians here in the US of A and the kinds of, you know, warmongering and abuse that's taking place here, which in the words of Martin Luther King, you know, we are bar none, you know, the greatest purveyor of violence the world has ever known. And that should inform your, you know, your thinking about this. So I think, you know, I talked to Howie about new knowledge and about, you know, the way the whole social media campaign is ridiculous and has been really taken out of context. How much does Russia spend? If you assume that this is Russian government, but, you know, the budget of the IRA is $12 million. So, and according to even experts associated with new knowledge and people who are driving this campaign, even some of them will acknowledge that most of Russia's work is internal. It's not, so, you know, cut that $12 million probably in half, at least.
Well, I think that they weren't even able to tie the IRA to the Russian government, right? I think that was actually part of the Mueller hearing was he was asking, one of the Republican congressmen was asking Mueller about how a judge had asked them to show it and they couldn't, and Mueller also couldn't provide any clarity there. So
your report famously links Russian internet troll farms with the Russian government. Yet at a hearing on May 28th in the Concord Management IRA prosecution that you initiated, the judge excoriated both you and Mr. Barr for producing no evidence to support this claim. Why did you suggest Russia was responsible for the troll farms when in court you've been unable to produce any evidence to support it?
Well, I'm not going to get into that any further than I already have.
But you have left the clear impression throughout the country through your report that it was the Russian government behind the troll farms, and yet when you're called upon to provide actual evidence in court, you fail to do so.
Well, I would again dispute your characterization of what occurred in that proceeding.
In fact, the judge, considered holding prosecutors in criminal contempt. She backed off only after your hastily called press conference the next day, in which you retroactively made the distinction between the Russian government and the Russia troll farms. Did your press conference of May 29th have anything to do with the threat to hold your prosecutors in contempt the previous day for publicly misrepresenting the evidence?
What was the question?
That's right. So in the court of law, this presumption has been rejected, and that entailed one particular corporation, the Concord Institute or something like that. And I don't know the details on that, but suffice it to say a court of law had rejected this presumption. And the presumption is based on the fact that the guy who owns the Internet Research Agency is himself a good friend of Putin. So it's thought that there's some coordination here, whether it's formal or informal isn't known. There is no definitive proof that this is an agency of the Russian government. Many investigative reporters, including Aaron Mate, have made the case that this is better explained as just clickbait because, and advertising that they're trying to sell. The internet itself, that is social media itself, is it's a hornet's nest of fraud, abuse, predatory manipulation. That's what goes on there. That's the basis for interactions. It's an exploitative media, and that characterizes its use politically as well. But that said, Russia appears to be a very modest player here, with a budget at greatest $12 million, and maybe it's not the Russian government, but $12 million, say worst case scenario. How much is the U.S. spending? At least $200 million on this same stuff. We got started way before when we started inventing sock puppets and software that enables you to manipulate people on social media. We invented that. The Israelis were in there as well, but I think we started doing the sock puppet stuff, although I'm not sure, but it's claimed, and you can go back and see reports in the media around 2011, I believe it was, that we actually began to contract to create this software for impersonation on social media. And we were warned at the time, experts warned, that if you go down this path, other countries are going to do it too. So it looks like, we can't just point the finger here at Russia that that we were very much a part of this. So at any rate, the whole Russia's role in this is very much blown out of proportion. Not only is their budget very small compared to big players like us or Israel, which I think have the biggest budgets for this, not only is the budget small, but the tools that they use are actually quite primitive. Cambridge Analytica used the data from something like 80 million, more than that, Facebook users, and they had hundreds, if not 1,000 or more data points on each person. So they've got very complex algorithms about everybody, and they can very specifically micro-target manipulative messages. Russia didn't do that. They just use Facebook pages. Mm-hmm. They did not use data mining, and they don't use that level of specific micro-targeting through complex algorithms.
Right.
So they're kind of a small player in this scheme of things. Their tools for social media manipulation are intensively analyzed, but that's because they are, a convenient issue here to try to blow up Russia's interference in our election. But, the stuff they try to blame on me, what are these great, powerful Facebook messages? Well, I've seen two. One was, a vote for Jill Stein is not a wasted vote.
Okay.
Really? If that was going to persuade people, we should be in the Oval Office for decades now. Greens could have done really well with that. And something else basically to that effect. Did I bring them with? I think I have here actually the images, the two most popular images.
Okay.
Should I just try to grab them? They're really funny. Here they are. Okay. Okay, so these were the most circulated images from the Russian Internet Research Agency.
Okay.
And you'll see how very powerful politically they are. This one, I think, was the most powerful Facebook image. Can you see that?
It says, I was banned from television for being too violent. Like and share if you grew up watching me on television, have a gun, and haven't shot or killed anyone. It's Yosemite Sam in front of a Confederate flag.
Yeah. So, is that a powerful image? Does that influence your vote? Yeah, it's the Confederate flag. Yeah, it's Yosemite Sam, but
It's just it's a stupid meme like you see it all over Facebook all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And then this one was the
So it has Jesus on the left, and it says, like if you believe, and Jesus on the right with a no sign in front of him. Keep scrolling if you don't. Okay.
Right. Yeah. These were the most circulated images from the Internet Research Agency. So you can see, this is not really compelling stuff that changes your vote, that gets you not to vote for Hillary Clinton and to vote for me instead. I don't think so. And it's really insulting to African American voters to say that this mobilized their discontent, as opposed to that, that they are horrifically, the disparities in income are just incredible for African Americans, and in education, the white supremacy is devastating out there, continues to ramify through the housing markets and the legacy of redlining, and the unbelievable health disparities as well, which is accounts for a decade or more of difference in longevity. So there are a lot of reasons why African Americans may not want to vote for a symbol of politics as usual and the economic and political elite. To say that that's because they were duped by this kind of ludicrous messaging on social media is really an insult.
So I did actually want to ask you about something I've read about with the recount, because what was interesting for me that Hillary Clinton has come after you is that I believe you cooperated with, or you partnered with the Clinton campaign, correct me if I'm wrong, for the recount in those states that Trump narrowly won. Is that accurate?
So the recount was really, the idea for it was really initiated by watchdogs and election integrity advocates. And I believe they had gone to Hillary and tried to get her to stand up about this. But, the political elite wants a orderly transition of power, and not necessarily a legitimate transition of power. And in the same way, they backed down around, the George Bush's election and the action of the Supreme Court, to stop the vote count. Al Gore was silent there, and Hillary Clinton was silent in her own, election quagmire. Did not stand up and call for a recount or raise questions about it. She could have, and she didn't. There may have been one lawsuit in Michigan, I think, where they might have been filed a sympathetic brief or something to that effect. But otherwise they kind of washed their hands of it.
Okay. So you didn't really work with them then towards the recount, because I guess at the time there were people in the Green Party that came out against you, had written something that they didn't want you cooperating. They didn't want Greens cooperating with the capitalist parties, and were critical of you about it. And I think later on, Kevin Zeese had written something in Counterpunch talking about this as well. So it seemed like there was a lot of opposition from them about you doing this. Has that sentiment continued on? Has there been any sort of lingering resentment about you pursuing that recount within the Green Party?
There was a small faction that really tried to say that this wasn't a Green thing to do. This is, the Green Party has traditionally done this. We stand up and call for accountability and transparency in our elections, and it's really integral to the Green Party. So, you know, their effort to sort of create some kind of controversy around it, it just kind of fell flat. And there's really, I think the Greens now, you know, really regard this as a very important achievement for the party, especially because we've been winning our lawsuits, and we were able to really raise the bar for paper ballots for the whole state of Pennsylvania, to really require paper ballots as a fundamental right of voters to a reliable, unhackable ballot. And you know, that has helped to raise the bar for the country. So I think people are now, for the most part, really proud of it.
Because the Kevin Zeese article in Counterpunch, it made it sound like, I guess there was another instance in 2017 at the convention when there was issues with the Black Caucus and the election of party co-chairs, and that, I guess it made it sound like some of the sentiment from what happened with there being opposition against the recount that had bled over into what happened in 2017. So are you saying that that's kind of gone away now?
You know, I think the factionalization is not a, what should we say? It's not unique to the Green Party, nor is the Green Party immune to it. So I think there are kind of factions that are, doing combat within the Green Party. I think the recount was at least as much a reflection of that as it was a cause of it.
Because this also bleeds over into the election this year, because I think that some of the presidential candidates, Ian Schlakman specifically, had raised the issue that it seems as though there's been cooperation between Green Party officials, because I think Andrea Merita had been a co-chair and now she's Howie Hawkins' campaign manager. And I think that Margaret Flowers also, she is a co-chair, and she was the one who launched the Howie Hawkins Exploratory Committee. So the accusation essentially, and Ian Schlakman has boycotted the nomination now, or the election, and I think that there might have been another candidate before him, saying their argument is that there's cooperation between the Green Party infrastructure and Howie Hawkins, and it's analogous to 2016 where the DNC was just trying to coronate Hillary Clinton, and that's happening now with Howie Hawkins. Do you feel that that's the case at all?
I think it really was a problem when people were supporting Howie's campaign from the steering committee. I agree that really needed to be fixed, and my understanding is that was fixed. The Green Party is a small party, so people tend to take double roles, and they serve as administrators, and they also serve on campaigns. And I think it's really important to draw the line where there are important administrative positions. People should not be on the, be principals in the campaigns. So I think there was a valid objection there. My understanding is that has, for the most part, been addressed. But yeah, it's a very difficult election. I mean, this has to be probably the worst playing field for Greens, because there's just utter hysteria out there to silence all third parties at this point. It's a really tough row to hoe, and that's, I would just, the insider baseball, you can always find stuff to look at there. I don't think it's particularly unusual or revealing at this point. I think, if people want less controversial campaigns, just look at the Senate race, the ranked choice voting race for Senate, and I think that could be a flagship race for people who, for one reason or other, don't like either the candidates or the struggles inside the presidential nomination.
Another complaint that Ian Schlakman, and I believe it was several other candidates, signed on to it, because the Green Party has a standard of official candidates and unofficial candidates, or recognized candidates and unrecognized. So Howie Hawkins and Dario Hunter have been recognized because I think that they raised a certain amount of money and also have gotten signatures or something like that. And other candidates have not been able to do that. And there's a November 4th deadline where I guess they're not going to be listed online or something. Do you think that, this November 4th deadline is good in kind of culling the field, or do you think that it may play into these accusations that the Green Party is just making it harder for other presidential candidates to have any kind of fair footing with Hawkins and I guess Daria?
Having been a part of the Green Party for 2 decades or so, I'm aware we generally bend over backwards to create an open playing field, but then you often get candidates who are really not qualified to be candidates, or they may have good ideas, but they really don't have a campaign. And, Greens are great for ideas, not always such great organizers, and I think it's really important once at some point, there need to be criteria in terms of having a campaign organization, having websites, having, fundraising ability, having staff. I have not seen the Green Party go overboard in requiring minimal criteria for legitimate campaigns. And I've seen many times some very unqualified candidates get up and parade as legitimate candidates, and that's a real issue for the party, is that we are often misrepresented by people who really do not have a base within the party, and they, everybody wants a soapbox to stand on, especially Greens. We tend to be very impassioned people, so people love having the presidential soapbox, and I think we have erred for many years, many cycles, too much on the side of an open race, and have had some very odd characters that don't do any favors for the party's credibility.
I think that part of the argument, though, is just how open and transparent the whole process is. Because again, there was these accusations about the party establishment, these co-chairs cooperating or boosting Howie. There was also another thing that happened on my show where there was this email that had gone out from the Mike Gravel campaign asking people to donate to Howie. And when I had Mike Gravel on, he said that he didn't know who Howie was.
Something else I wanted to ask you about today was Howie Hawkins. Are you endorsing him?
No, I don't know much about him, and so I haven't endorsed anybody else in that regard.
Do you know who Howie Hawkins is?
Well, he sent me some emails, but I haven't read them. I've just been so busy with so many emails that I get. So, to my knowledge, no, I haven't endorsed him, and I don't know what he represents in that regard.
Okay, because there was an email that went out from your campaign, or addressed from your campaign, that was asking people to donate to the Howie Hawkins campaign. Did you know about that email?
No, I didn't. And you have to understand that my campaign was run by teenagers, and on a couple of occasions they can endorse who they want as individuals, but they don't necessarily bind me on any endorsements in that regard.
I then recently had them back on. He said that a meeting had been arranged where Howie met with him, and now he's endorsing him.
Have you met Howie Hawkins since that time?
Yes, I have, and I was very impressed with him. And his problem is he has to get the nomination of the Green Party, and so I indicated here again, endorsing after meeting with him and talking with him about the issues. I said I would endorse him and hope that he would win the nomination for the Green Party.
And then also there was another issue that they had about the rules, saying that they were being unfairly applied, was that there's a part of the Green Party rules that say that, I'll read you the rule, it's 10.1.2, party affiliation. It says, candidate is not a registrant or otherwise a party member of any state or national level political party in the individual's primary state of residence, except for a state party which has affiliated with GPUS, or a party forming for the intent of GPUS affiliation in a state where there is no GPUS affiliated state party. And Howie Hawkins just yesterday got the Socialist Party USA nomination, so he would be, if he won the Green Party nomination, he'd be running with both. But this, I guess, goes into the argument that the rules are being unfairly applied, because the argument is that he's not allowed to be a member of the Socialist Party USA. So again, I think the overall issue is that there are some people in the Green Party who have the feeling like the rules are being applied unfairly. It's an uneven playing field, and that they're just trying to install Howie Hawkins as the nominee.
Yeah, party dynamics, I think, are always full of cross currents. I'll say when I was a candidate, I got endorsed by another political party as well, and we often think that. So,
were you a member of that party?
No, I don't. I don't think I had to join it, but I was cross-endorsed. I know many people in the party who are registered members of the Socialist Party, and I've never heard of any objections being raised to their being our candidates at the state or the national level, and they often are, because our goal is to try to bring non-corporate, people-powered political parties together. So I'm not familiar. It's a little bit more insider baseball than I'm a party to,
honestly, just to be transparent, from my perspective, I think it is a good thing for third parties to cooperate. I think I've even talked to you before about how I thought the Green Party and Libertarian Party should work together.
Yeah.
It's just, again, it goes back to the complaint is from the other presidential candidates that the rules are being unfairly applied.
Well, I have to say they're not being applied any different from how they've been applied for many years. I think initially, early on, when Howie's campaign manager was also on the steering committee, I think that was not good. But I don't think that can explain why some people don't have organized campaigns yet. And I think there's an effort being made to explain away the lack of organization by some of the candidates that maybe not quite ready for prime time.
And then another thing I want to ask you about is I had Jesse Ventura on the show recently, and he had floated the idea of possibly running for the Green Party nomination with Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
So will you ever run for president? Will you seek the Green Party nomination?
I don't know. You'll find out in the spring. Why would I do it now? Wait till the Pikers are gone.
Okay. Well, Governor,
it's all about tactics, man. It's tactics. That's how you win. It ain't time now. It's too early.
I sincerely hope that you do run for president this year, and I think it would be awesome if you did.
Well, let me just leave you with this. What do you think about a ticket? Imagine this ticket. Governor Jesse Ventura and Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
That sounds great. I would love to see that.
He quits the Democratic Party and joins me with the Greens.
What would you think about if he did say in a few months, yes, I want to run for the Green Party presidential nomination?
I'd be really interested in talking with him. I certainly would not shut it down. Jesse is a very powerful spokesperson. Are our visions and agendas compatible? Would he be running as a Green, and would he be running to build the party? Would be my question. But I regard that as a really interesting development. If Robert F. Kennedy was interested in running as,
and again, that was just Jesse talking. So.
I see. Yeah. I would certainly be interested in dialoguing with both of them.
Would he be able to run after the November 4th cutoff? Or is that a cut? Do you know if that's a cutoff for being able to run, or is that just being listed online as a recognized candidate?
Yeah, actually, I don't know, but I can find out.
Okay. Do you think that there would be this similar sort of dynamic where there would be people in places of power who might support Howie Hawkins working against a Jesse Ventura campaign, or if some, Cynthia McKinney or just some other person decided they want to enter the race?
Yeah, I think it would be really important to ensure that that people who have a conflict of interest because they represent another campaign should not be in, they should be recused from decision making around this. And I'm not, I don't know who that would be. You know, is this a steering committee interpretation or what? I don't know, but I would hope that this is guided by rules and it doesn't require a decision of an administrator. If the rules allow another person to become a member of the party and seek the nomination, if they qualify by the criteria, they should be able to do that, and then let the voters decide in their primaries in the various states. Let the voters decide.
So I did want to ask you about a couple of just issues that have been coming up, sort of new ideas in this campaign. Well, one of them is not so new. It's student loan forgiveness, which you had floated and kind of made popular in 2016. Bernie Sanders had suggested a different version of it, which would be, because your version, as I recall, was something about monetary policy, where you'd have the Federal Reserve effectively forgive the student loans. Bernie Sanders is a tax on certain Wall Street exchanges. So are you supportive of his efforts because it would effectively be the same thing, or do you have any kind of thoughts on just the dynamics of how his plan is different from yours?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the difference is mainly with regard to the funding mechanism, but we had tried to clarify that there were many ways that this could be funded. It could be funded through quantitative easing, but it could also be funded by, cutting the military budget and redirecting some of those dollars.
I think
it could also be funded
John
by
Oliver
tax.
didn't John Oliver come after you because of saying that you weren't clear on how it would be funded?
Well, he ridiculed the concept of quantitative easing, but
Okay.
that's actually some Democratic candidates actually are supporting quantitative easing as the way to come up with the money.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean that was a totally political move from a show which is, very nicely within the confines of what progressive Democrats are allowed to do, and part of that is to destroy anybody that they consider their competition, or I should say try to destroy their competition.
So do you think that Bernie Sanders' plan to tax these, I think it's trading on certain kinds of tools, that's a good way to be doing the same technique of forgiving student loans?
Sure, yeah, right. I think that is the, what is it called? There's a name for it, but it's basically a very tiny tax on. It's a Wall Street transaction tax.
Yes.
Is what that's called, and that could raise, by just applying a tax of less than 1%, hundreds of billions of dollars could be raised. So that's kind of a very big funding mechanism that could apply for student. For forgiving student debt and potentially for other things down the line. You could say we've now committed I think it's $1.5 trillion to creating a new generation of nuclear weapons. Well, how about instead of a new generation of nuclear weapons, how about instead we liberate a new generation of Americans and cancel their student debt. So that would be another way that this could be funded. There are many ways it can be done, but it's basically it's a development package, of incredible power and proportions, because it really liberates enormous economic creativity from people who are otherwise in economic bondage. So it's a definite win-win.
One other idea I wanted to ask you about, because it's really coming out of seemingly nowhere, is UBI. I understand that Andrew Yang has a very specific version of universal basic income where it would be $1,000 a month. And there's been some criticism of him because he's not for Medicare for all, and he's for you getting Medicare from your employer. And his whole pitch for UBI is that jobs are being automated, so it's kind of contradictory. But I was just wondering, overall, what are your thoughts on universal basic income? Do you think that it's something that we will need to be pursuing? Do you think because of specifically job automation, or are there other reasons, and just any kind of thoughts that you have on UBI?
So my sense, I really agree in principle with it, but I think that in today's current context where we have a climate emergency, that there is, sort of everybody needs universal basic income through a universal guarantee of a job that will help us through this emergency transition for energy, food, and transportation the production of green housing and so on. I think there is work for everyone to be done right now as part of the Green New Deal. So I would sort of apply it through that.
Well, I know we went a lot longer than we said we would. I just had, I'm starting this new thing where I let patrons submit questions. So if you're a supporter of my show, people can submit questions to the guest and also find out who the guest is ahead of time. So I just wanted to read you the questions that we had received.
Cool.
So if you don't mind,
Sure.
This is from Jackie. She says, "First, I voted for you in 2016. I agree that we need a major third party. What do you see as the political weaknesses of the National Green Party? I'm not talking about where Greens have led, but political and electoral weaknesses."
Yeah, I think the weakness is that we are in a structure that instills fear of third parties. And I think that, that people are told to be very afraid of the consequences of a third party vote. I think that is the biggest liability of trying to move forward. And that's why I think that promoting ranked choice voting in your state and getting involved with an initiative to pressure the legislature to fortify our elections and provide safeguards for our elections, not only by providing paper ballots, but by providing ranked choice voting on an emergency basis so that we actually have it by 2020.
So I have another question here. It says, "Hillary wonders if you will give it up. Do you wonder if she will give it up? The New York Times reported she is privately considering a run."
Yes, I've heard that from several accounts, and I think, I sure hope she will give it up. I am not entertaining a run this election, and who knows what Hillary is thinking, and this would be a terrible thing for America if she ran.
Hector asks, "Are you planning to endorse a candidate for the Green Party nomination? If yes, when and can we have a hint? If you already know who, can you tell us and why?"
Okay. I don't. I think there are strengths and drawbacks, to our whole spectrum of candidates. So I am not, at this point, entertaining an endorsement, but I am focusing on this Senate race for Susan Collins' seat, because this is an election we can actually win. And it can also, I think, be a flagship race that the party nationally can mobilize around, because this one doesn't have the complexities and the very steeply tilted playing field of the presidential race. So this is a really great place for us to lay out our agenda where there's a really civil dialogue around it and we are not being suppressed. And by focusing on that race, I think we can help promote the liberation of our votes across the whole nation. Because when people see what a difference it is when you actually have an election with debate and civil dialogue, it's really transformative, and I think people will demand it everywhere.
So last question from Peter. It says, "Is there any chance that the Green Party would endorse Bernie Sanders for president, preferably before the primaries, rather than run its own presidential candidate?"
Well, I think we've seen why that would be a bad idea, because when Bernie Sanders then gets sabotaged, where do you go?
Right.
So it's really, I think, that would be rolling over, on the railroad tracks, is to give up resistance as it is being, sabotaged within the Democratic Party. I would instead invite the, those who are struggling in the Democratic Party, I would invite them to, to step up to the plate and really fight for democracy, where the sand isn't just going to be washed away from out from under us. That's the problem of fighting inside of a counter-revolutionary party. When the campaign is over, poof, it's all gone. On the other hand, if you're in a third party, you've been fighting, then you keep building. And I think the world right now is in an uprising. Look at Chile, look at Lebanon, look at Ecuador, look at Iraq. the world is not going to take this sitting down anymore, and I think we're in a moment of real transition. It begs for a political vehicle inside this country too, so this really is the time to stand up and fight for the greater good, like our lives depend on it, because they do, and now that transformation really is within arm's reach.
Well, Jill, I really appreciate you being on this episode of Primo Nutmeg. It's always great to sit down and discuss these topics at length. For folks out there who would like to follow you and get involved with your projects, how can they do that?
Best way is through my Twitter account, which is probably my most active, vehicle these days. So that's just at Dr. Jill Stein. That's right. Dr. No period. Jill Stein.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate your time.
Likewise. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.